Nintendo's neglected game series. I love Nintendo. As a game developer, they make some of the best games and have some of the best talent in the industry. However, as a business, Nintendo always makes some questionable decisions from time to time. And most of the time, it's not even the common issues that all the other AAA publishers are criticized for. Nintendo has a way of finding its own way to just make some bad calls. And as a pretty die-hard Nintendo fan, the most frustrating of them all is when Nintendo neglects one of their own video game series in one way or another. Like, get this. Say The Legend of Zelda is your favorite video game series. If you're a Zelda fan, you typically can expect something pretty cool from Nintendo on a pretty regular basis. You get some new games, a couple of re-releases or remakes, and some cool spin-offs in between. I mean, Zelda games sell well, so it makes sense. Heck, even Kirby's had 7 games on the Nintendo Switch. Now, I say this all the time on this channel, so allow me to beat this already dead horse. Animal Crossing is the second best-selling Nintendo Switch game. Animal Crossing New Horizons sold 42 million copies, which is more than The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom combined, and yet Nintendo completely abandoned this franchise after pretty much 1 year. I mean, technically the final big update came out a year and a half after Animal Crossing release, but that was like 6 months after updates practically slowed to a complete stop. So of course, with how popular Animal Crossing is, surely you would think Nintendo would treat this franchise with at least as much content as other big franchises under Nintendo's IPs. Nope. Animal Crossing fans are just waiting for anything. I don't know if Nintendo feels that there has to be like a big gap between Animal Crossing content, but the gaps between games has been increasingly getting larger, and updates to existing titles like New Horizons were sunsetted a long time ago. I mean, we had to wait 7 years between the release of Animal Crossing New Leaf on the 3DS to Animal Crossing New Horizons on the Switch, skipping the Wii U generation altogether. And I don't know if it's good or bad, but Nintendo still occasionally tries to acknowledge Animal Crossing's success and its fan base by sometimes throwing something out there, like a concert with DJ KK playing on some screens in Japan. Cool. Or there's like a museum thing going on in Seattle, Washington. That's all you guys are getting for Animal Crossing news. I'm not saying I fully expected Nintendo to go full on and release a new Animal Crossing game every single year or something like that, but I do feel like it is odd that there's not regular updates in the same vein of what is done in Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, for example. Now, typically it's reported that the same studio that works on the Animal Crossing games will alternate between an Animal Crossing title and Splatoon, and after Animal Crossing New Horizons, they worked on Splatoon 3, and Splatoon 3 is great for the fan base that enjoys those games, but they get so much content on a normal basis with different seasons and events and crossovers to promote other games. Why can't they also take that to Animal Crossing with how hugely successful it was? When Pokémon Scarlet and Violet were releasing, Splatoon had something going on. It would have been really cool to see something like that in Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing did a little thing for Mario and a little thing for like Hello Kitty randomly, but then after that, nothing. This game is just abandonware pretty much to Nintendo now, though they still sell the game, they still market new Nintendo Switch models that are Animal Crossing themed. Listen, Nintendo has the reputation of charging a premium price for a lot of their content and games, and rarely going on sale on some of these prices, but for once, there's an actual community of fans who would buy whatever Nintendo would put out if it was Animal Crossing content. I obviously prefer free DLC, but hey, paid DLC, if it's like at the same level of depth and quality of something like Happy Home Paradise, is a win also. I mean, if Mario Kart 8 can get DLC, why can't Animal Crossing? Instead, a lot of the Animal Crossing community is worried that we're going to be in another huge gap of time before a new game releases. And this time, it feels like it could be even longer than the 7-year gap we already had to wait between main games. After the holidays, we'll be approaching 4 years since Animal Crossing New Horizons released, and I just have a feeling that it's not like Animal Crossing will be a launch title for the next generation of consoles, which means we might have a long wait ahead of us. Either way, whenever they do announce the next Animal Crossing game, I think it's going to be very important for the fan base to see that this game will be supported better than Animal Crossing New Horizons was, because this wasn't very acceptable. Okay, now you might think, why is Pokemon going to be included in this video? With the frequency of Pokemon games and spin-offs that this series gets, surely Pokemon players eat good. Also, technically, Nintendo only owns a third of Pokémon, but we're still counting it here. Listen, Pokémon might eat good, but for a franchise that literally is the highest grossing franchise of all time, it's honestly surprising how many corners end up getting cut in the releases of the main series Pokémon games nowadays. And I'll be honest, I'm probably not as enraged as some members in the Pokémon community are. I mean, the Pokémon fan base can go wild sometimes. And honestly, I'm probably a part of the problem because I will see some of the changes or shortcomings of the game that everyone's talking about ahead of time, and then I still buy the game and I'll play through it and I'll enjoy it. And because there's millions of other players also like me, the games will sell incredibly well. And I feel like that perpetuates the idea that these corners and shortcomings are okay because people will buy them anyways. This game series is owned partially by Nintendo and sells 25 million units in a new release. These are Call of Duty AAA release numbers here, and the game is selling for $60. Yet the game development seems to remain small and rather inexpensive rather than being the big production that Pokemon really should be with how much money this game series brings in. I'm not saying the new Pokemon games aren't fun, but when graphics look like this, when we know that the Switch is capable of much better graphics, there's no justification for the graphics to look like this when it's Nintendo and they know what their hardware is capable of and how to maximize its efficiency. This game will sell 25 million copies and not even have voice acting in the game. There are other games out there that are in the RPG storytelling genre that are even on the Switch and have full, well fleshed out voice acting localization. I'm thinking specifically of Persona 5 Royal in this example, and they can't even get a consistent frame rate in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. The good thing here is that at the very least, the new Pokemon games that release are still a fun experience, but I genuinely think fans deserve better. These games deserve to have way more polish than what they're getting at the time of their release. And don't even get me started with Pokemon Brilliant, Diamond, and Shining Pearl. At this point, I would just be repeating the things that other people have argued about these games, but at the end of the day, instead of giving us a true remake in the form of what fans had expected, what was essentially a rushed port of the original Diamond and Pearl games handed off to some other studio who's never even made a game before, was essentially thrown together and a new chibi art style was used, which really was just, let's be real, an excuse to beat around the fact that the game wouldn't be built from the ground up to match the newer art styles that are there. There was a time period where Pokemon remakes would release and push the game series further than the newest entry at the time. But if you hold Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl next to Sword and Shield, it's obvious which one feels like the newer game. It still blows my mind that in the remakes of Diamond and Pearl, you can do glitches that existed in the original Diamond and Pearl, and also new glitches were discovered in the remakes of Diamond and Pearl that then actually work in the old Diamond and Pearl that were undiscovered until the remakes came out. It's just hard because a lot of the times these Pokemon games feel like they have some really cool ideas going for them, the jump to the open world style. But man, how much cooler would it have been if they just took more time and had a bigger team to just really polish things up and make the game feel like the massive AAA title that it is. And that's just us talking about the main games. I will talk about some of the spin-offs a little bit later in this video. But since we're talking about good ideas that aren't seen through, there's a couple of other Nintendo points we need to talk about. Okay, just because I used Mario Kart as an example earlier in this video doesn't mean I won't acknowledge the struggle Mario Kart fans have had over the course of the Nintendo Switch's lifetime. Sure, they're eating good now with new DLC, a game series that used to have a new game to come out with every console Nintendo would release. How is it that Nintendo chose not to do a new Mario Kart during the life of Nintendo Switch? Remember, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe started out as Mario Kart 8 on the Wii U, and do you think that at that Nintendo Direct in January of 2013 when they announced that Mario Kart 8 was in the works, anyone thought that they'd still be playing that same exact Mario Kart game 10 years later? Yet, here we are. Fans have desperately wanted a Mario Kart 9, just a brand new Mario Kart game, and I think now that we're getting towards the end of the Switch's life cycle, it's more than likely not at all happening. We might be lucky to get a new Mario Kart whenever the next Nintendo console does release, hopefully, but honestly, I'm so surprised that with this game that was re-released on Nintendo Switch in 2017, 5 years after its release, Nintendo finally got around to being like, oh, yeah, this game is popular, let's do some DLC for it. No. 2022 is when they should have announced the new Mario Kart game that they had been working on for all of those years or something. Not that there would be some new DLC maps coming in the future. And while the DLC maps are a good consolation prize, I guess, since we're not getting a new game. I won't be as harsh, but 5 years of nothing is brutal for the #1 best-selling Nintendo Switch game with 55 million units sold. In an era where games are nowadays supported years after their release. It's not the early 2010s anymore where games release and maybe have a couple of little expansions and then that's it. I really wish Nintendo would realize that if a game releases and has a strong player base, the game could continue to be supported long term. And it seems like only now is Nintendo maybe starting to realize that post-game support is a thing. Like Splatoon 3 has more post-game support than it seems like any Nintendo release. And Splatoon 3 is the 18th best-selling Switch game. Like there's so many other games that I really expect to see more from. I'm glad Splatoon 3 gets that support, but what about all these other games? I'm honestly really surprised that we don't see more from games like Mario Odyssey, Pokémon, Animal Crossing, Mario Party, even Switch Sports got very minimal DLC, but here's a couple new Kirby games every year. And then on the other side of things, where there's fans who really just want to get into Mario Kart and play something new, we finally did get a new Mario Kart game in a mobile game, and it's fine. It's not as competitive and it's its own thing, and the controls and all of that work a lot differently, and I honestly haven't played it enough to see if it's actually predatory towards microtransactions or not. Hopefully it's not. But man, how hard is it when you're desperately hoping for a new Mario Kart game and instead they release a Mario Kart phone game, which isn't the same thing. And more importantly, where is Mario Kart Double Dash 2? We're still waiting for it. Now, of course, when it comes to Nintendo franchises, Nintendo has their favorite IPs, the ones that they like to see a lot of releases for. Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, Metroid, and second party, but still, the Kirby series. Now here's the thing, I genuinely like the fact that Nintendo has their IPs and they utilize their IPs and they put games out. However, sometimes it feels like some of these game franchises get away with essentially pitching a really cool concept for a game to the wider Nintendo fan base and Nintendo Switch users, but they don't really take things a step further and create a full-on gaming experience that is worth that $60 price tag. I know you could make the argument with games like Kirby and the Forgotten Land that maybe the target demographic is younger. I don't know if I really buy that though. I have a feeling that if you're gonna make a game that appeals to a wide age range, it truly is an all ages game like Kirby, which has been around for decades and use the brand recognition that has been established from older Kirby games existing over the decades, the younger audience argument is kind of moot. I'm gonna target Kirby and the Forbidden Land a little bit more specifically, but what I'm saying here applies for a lot of games that Nintendo puts out, like Yoshi's Woolly World or like Captain Toad's Treasure Tracker. Yoshi was 12 hours long, Kirby 10 hours, Treasure Tracker 7.5 hours. Now of course, game length isn't everything, but when the game itself is a game that probably doesn't have the highest replayability demand and a very, very low skill ceiling, I feel like it's really hard to feel satisfied with the game by the time you reach the finish line just having spent $60 on the game. And because it's Nintendo, these games seemingly never go on sale at all. I feel like over the years, Nintendo fans have almost lowered the expectation out of how much content a video game provides if you're buying a game for the Switch. And maybe nowadays we're more used to the limited amount of content that some of these games have. Sure, with Nintendo games, you are getting very well-crafted experiences. Like with any of these games, you know there was a lot of talent behind the scenes working on these games. It's just a shame that so many of these games are just so short. It really drives home this idea that if the game can reach a more core audience, then Nintendo will put more resources into making the game longer and well received better. But if they're doing something just for their Nintendo fans, a lot of the times it's just a what you see is what you get type experience. We know that Nintendo has the capacity to make amazing, large-scale games because they've made them before. But when I was a broke college kid, these are the type of games I had to choose to skip out on. Either lower the price or flesh it out so it's a game experience that you literally can't miss out on. And honestly, Pokemon has fallen into this a couple of times as well. Earlier in the video we mentioned how Pokemon is the #1 highest grossing franchise. That's insane. And of course, with that, over the years there has been a ton of spin-off non-main Pokemon games that have released. Honestly, I'm all for this, especially when the game goes above and beyond and does something very unique. I was lucky enough to grow up in the mystery dungeon era of Pokemon, because if you could get into the mystery dungeon games back in the day, it was a solid experience. These games were fleshed out, a completely different approach on a Pokemon title taking place in a separate timeline and have an experience where you actually get to play as the Pokemon. These things had great stories, a challenging difficulty curve, and a decent amount of replayability. It's actually no surprise how this game series ended up spinning off into its own miniature Pokemon series separate from the mainline games, and would see quite a few entries in the series. But things randomly slowed down, and we got one last game for the 3DS before we had nothing. And then we had a random remake, which was really interesting in the art style direction, and now the series is back to being dormant again. It's very interesting with this whole video topic we're looking at here, because I feel like Pokemon falls into the same issues that all of Nintendo falls into in one way or another. They introduce something cool and not stick with it, or they have all of these spin-off ideas that are interesting, but they don't push the boundary of the game, like what we just said about Kirby, for example. If you're a Pokemon fan of these other Pokemon games, you've been disappointed more times than just once. Right now, one of the big disappointments people are talking about is the new Detective Pikachu game, which is a straight up sequel, but is this really like the $60 experience that is finally possible now that it's on the Switch? Honestly, graphically, this is kind of horrendous. It looks like a low-grade 3DS game, maybe. Fans have been waiting for a new Detective Pikachu game for 7 years. People thought the sequel would come out sometime around the time the movie came out, and that definitely didn't happen, and this is what we get. $60 again, Pokemon New Snap, or Pokemon Snap 2, a visually beautiful experience that captured the fun that the original Pokemon Snap game was back in the day. The main game's like 11 hours long, which, okay, but the amount of times you have to go and replay the same on-rails course is kind of excessive. Sometimes it can take 3 or 4 attempts through a course before you have been able to see everything that you need to see to move on and get a new location in the game. I did really enjoy this game. I'm not going to lie about that, but I do have to wonder, am I just being a cheapskate for being upset that it was $60? I just feel like there was a lot of room for more locations, more Pokemon to be shown. Heck, they should have even remade the original courses and added them in this game too. There are so many spin-off games that have come and been forgotten about over the years that would be amazing to see return in some form or another. The Pokemon Pinball series was great on the original Game Boy Color, and the Ruby and Sapphire one on Game Boy Advance was an amazing experience. Did anyone have the trading card game back on their Game Boy Color? I had that, and that was really cool. Now there's an actual trading card website and an app that released after years of being in development, and it's very poorly made. Why do I feel like Pokken Tournament had so much potential but was just never really given the tender loving care that it needed to be super successful? There was Pokemon Ranger, Pokemon Rumble, Pokemon Troze, and now we have Pokemon Cafe Remix. This is exhausting. Before the days of giant cinematic universes existing, Super Smash Bros. Was literally the ultimate franchise crossover in existence, and it really solidified the fact that Nintendo had some of the strongest IPs in the video game market. And sure, over the years, the Smash Bros. Universe has evolved to include other game series outside of Nintendo's scope, but Super Smash Bros. Has always been a celebration of Nintendo. And I think Super Smash Bros. Also helped elevate the fact that a lot of these characters have historical significance, and we can see a lot of these characters still relevant in new games that come out. But there's also a lot of characters that are significant that are often overlooked by Nintendo when new games are in development. Like, let's look at Pit from Kid Icarus. When Super Smash Bros. Brawl was announced, they showcased that Pit was going to be included in the roster and had this cool redesign, bringing a character from this to this, and it brought this character into the forefront of a massive game. And a lot of people who didn't know the history of the game Kid Icarus were curious who this character was and where they were from. And then finally, Nintendo greenlit a new Kid Icarus game in Kid Icarus Uprising for the 3DS, and the game actually wasn't that bad. Now, in the early years of the 3DS, the handheld itself kind of suffered, and maybe the sales for Kid Icarus weren't as high as Nintendo had hoped, and since then, this brand new revived franchise just wouldn't have anything released again. It's a shame because the whole Kid Icarus universe that we see in Smash Bros. And we see in Kid Icarus Uprising looks like we're finally getting a look into this really awesome world with a ton of opportunities to explore different lore, and then it's just completely dropped. Honestly, a similar thing could be said about other characters too that have shown up randomly in Smash Bros, like Ice Climbers. They went from an NES game to appearing in Smash Bros Melee, and I'm honestly surprised that these characters haven't shown up in some sort of new media either. People now know who Ice Climbers are because of Smash Bros, so why not use that? And honestly, this argument could be said for a lot of other characters. I mean, look at Lil Mac from Punch-Out! Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Was a big deal back in the NES days, and Punch-Out! Would return to an extent in the late 2000s, which was surprising, and then nothing ever again after Lil Mac was finally included in Smash Bros. 4. Nintendo's literally just sitting on these characters, not doing anything with them. Hey, when it comes to Smash Bros, there's even characters that started out as these iconic Nintendo IPs, but would slowly be forgotten about by Nintendo altogether. I mean, ultimate Nintendo forgotten neglect going on here. F-Zero has had a rough-ish run, to say the least. It's crazy to think that more people probably know Captain Falcon from Super Smash Bros. Now than, you know, F-Zero, the game series that he actually comes from. F-Zero back in the day was a crazy experience. It was like a racing game. These tracks were out of control. On the Nintendo 64 version, I could never keep my race car inside the track and always would fly off the edge and get eliminated before the race ended. What's really odd about F-Zero overall is it seemed like this franchise was hitting its stride when the GameCube version released. This version was awesome. Not only were the cutscenes pre-rendered randomly, which was an interesting added bonus for some story attached to it all, but this game came in clutch in a time where GameCube was really not offering as big of experiences as the Xbox and the PlayStation 2 were. Nintendo needed to rely heavily on their first-party games to stand out, and I think that that's where we saw some interesting game concepts come out of that. But after that, we saw nothing ever again from F-Zero. Captain Falcon would show up, he'd do his thing, and then he was gone. I'm genuinely surprised that through all of the years of DS games, we never had an F-Zero release. The stylus could have made things very interesting. Then the Wii era with motion controls, it was almost a shoo-in that we would get a F-Zero game. The Star Fox series is another game series that fell fate to this exact same thing. First, they turned a game that was completely not related to Star Fox into a Star Fox game just because the characters looked similar with Star Fox Adventures. We would get a follow-up game that I thought was so amazing back in the day, Star Fox Assault, and then we did get this weird DS game that had amazing gameplay but a bonkers story, and that might have resulted in us not getting a new Star Fox game for a long time. Nothing in the Wii era, despite the fact that the Wii controller could have been really cool. We got a 3DS remake, and then finally, after years and years, Star Fox Zero. It was a retelling of a remaster of the original, which was originally a reboot of the Super Nintendo version. The game was fine, it just didn't offer up enough new experiences. And a lot of people really disliked the Wii U required gamepad controlling, and visually speaking, for a Wii U title, this game wasn't all that impressive, so the game didn't do very well, and surprisingly would be one of the few games not to be ported over to Nintendo Switch from the Wii U collection of games. Star Fox would get one final chance with Starlink Battle for Atlas. We all know how that went. And since then, we haven't heard a single peep about Star Fox. And this game is just now down there with F-Zero, except F-Zero randomly gets to make a comeback. That was unexpected. Yeah, in a bold move by Nintendo, they decided to make a Battle Royale racing game based on the Super Nintendo F-Zero game. Now, of course, this isn't exactly a new F-Zero game like we expected, but at least it's something. It's like a little revival just reminding people that this game series exists, which is better than that one Star Fox Command ending that had Fox and Falco become F-Zero races or something. Yeah, that game was still really weird. Okay, Pilot Wings is another Nintendo 64 era game that just wasn't really represented all that well over the years. Now, we do know Pilot Wings started off back in the Super Nintendo days, but man, there were Nintendo 64s in America that were bundled with Pilot Wings after the N64's launch, and I was one of those kids. Who had one? Yeah, I didn't have Mario 64, surprisingly, with my N64, but I did have Pilot Wings, and this game rocked. seriously, I can't say this enough. You can pick up this game all these years later and have a very good time. The gameplay is addicting. Trying to get the perfect score, mastering the flight the way that you need to. It is incredibly challenging, but it's a lot of fun. I don't know, just something about these types of motion games that challenge your accuracy and control over variables sometimes just makes for some really great experiences, and I've just always appreciated Pilot Wings. But over the years, we haven't really seen anything from Pilot Wings. We had a 3DS game that really wasn't that much of a Pilot Wings. Like, they had Pilot Wings in the title, but they also were trying to show it off as like a sequel to Wii Resort. And it was like they couldn't decide between what brand to put this game under, so they just said, yeah, both. And while it was cool to see representation from Pilot Wings once again, I don't feel like it really is the same charm factor that the Nintendo 64 one had. And the soundtrack that accompanied Pilot Wings was honestly top tier. Some of the best music on the entire Nintendo 64. They brought Pilot Wings back, of course, on the Nintendo 64 service with Nintendo Online, but I'd love to see a real game remade with the original direction that the older Pilot Wing games had, like the SNES or N64 version, brought to the modern day. Now, I don't know if this would work better as a full game or an indie game, but it could be such a great experience. You guys all remember how big of a deal it was when Super Mario 64 came out? Like, it created a new genre of 3D platform collectathon adventures, and it was awesome. And it's just really weird to me how successful this game was back in the day, but then alternatively, Nintendo with their 3D Mario platformer games moving forward seem to be very hesitant to necessarily release things or make things. I'm not advocating for over-flooding the market with more 3D Mario games like Mario 64, but the fact that in like the 25 years since Mario 64, we had Mario Sunshine, the 2 Mario Galaxy games, and Mario Odyssey. Oh, and the little slice of Bowser's Fury too. I'm just saying, in a world where we get a new Call of Duty game every single year, a few Pokémon and spin-offs a year, and a whole bunch of Fire Emblem games, how is it that we can't seem to have a 3D Mario game release once in a blue moon whenever the stars actually align? I think it's really interesting that they released Super Mario 3D All-Stars, by the way, for Nintendo Switch, which is an awesome collection, though the handling of this was interesting. They put it for a limited release where the game would no longer be available, and this game is the ultimate collection, compilation of all of Mario's greatest 3D adventures, except the entirety of Super Mario Galaxy 2. Yeah, that just never came out. I think that that's such a weird one. I thought for sure that with this release, they'd release it, and then later Super Mario Galaxy 2 would either be added as some DLC, or would see its own re-release in its own right, just maybe at a later time or something like that. I thought actually the reason they were limiting the timed releases was because we were going to be getting some sort of Nintendo 64 GameCube type service, so maybe they were going to do full releases of Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 separately later. And while I was right about Super Mario 64 coming onto the Nintendo 64 emulator on the Switch, Mario Galaxy 2 fans just got really straight up forgotten about. Mario Galaxy 2 is like the pinnacle of Nintendo neglect. I do have to also mention though that Super Mario 3 All-Stars did make some small changes also though to some of the original games. They're not straight one-to-one copies or replicas, which is fine. For Super Mario Sunshine, they removed the trigger control for the water pressure because the GameCube controller had analog triggers and the Switch controller has digital triggers. So they added this like motion control system. And then in Super Mario 64's re-release, they removed the line where it sounds like Mario says, "So long, gay Bowser."
So long, gay Bowser.
They originally changed this in the DS version that was like a rebuild of the game for Nintendo DS, but it is interesting that they went as far as going into the game just to change this line because of the misconception that's existed for like 25 years. I mean, of course, Mario is Nintendo's mascot and flagship, so we can expect new Mario games every year. To some extent, there's always a new Mario game around the corner, but the 3D genre overall, I don't know, I just wish there was more of it. But even more so, if you look back at the Nintendo 64 era, collectathons were a huge deal, and nowadays it almost feels like a relic from the past. I mean, when it came to collectathons, the Nintendo 64 era leading into the next generation of consoles was like the prime time, and Nintendo 64 had the most collectathons and probably some of the biggest and best ones. We already talked about Mario 64, obviously, but then Rare busted out a ton of them with Banjo-Kazooie. Then they followed that up with Donkey Kong 64. Boom, 5 characters, and they introduced Chunky Kong. What a win. The next year there was Banjo-Tooie, and then lastly, Conker's Bad Fur Day, which, you know, that was for the grown-ups. And of course, we most importantly can't forget about good old Gex 64. Now, both during the N64 era and onwards, in the years following, we definitely didn't see as many collectathon platformers release too much. Yeah, there was Spyro the Dragon hanging out on the PlayStation side of things, but with Rare being acquired by Microsoft, we would see Rare pivot away from platformers, and since they were some of the biggest 3D collectathon developers, we never did see that third Banjo-Kazooie game that fans had really hoped for, and no, Nuts and Bolts doesn't count. So it makes sense. Nintendo obviously didn't have the rights to Banjo-Kazooie, and they did put Mario 3D games out on occasion, but as far as a true-to-form experience that goes back, it's kind of been lackluster. Nintendo still had a huge opportunity with Donkey Kong under its belt, and they did go the route of reviving the Donkey Kong Country franchise with Donkey Kong Country Returns and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. So that's great that they revisited a very popular side-scrolling genre that was popularized especially in the Super Nintendo era, but I just wish Nintendo would also move the bar and maybe utilize either the Donkey Kong franchise or create a new IP to kind of fill that void that we miss from the lost genre of true-to-form 3D collectathon adventures. Now, I know some people didn't like how much stuff there was to collect in Donkey Kong 64, but if you played the game back in the day when you were a kid, you know that this game was just awesome. It doesn't matter what people say about the game now. It was awesome back then, it's still kind of low-key awesome now. Now, there are a few 3D collectathons out there that try to capture that platformer adventure feeling that was so prominent back in the day. I mean, Mario Odyssey is living proof, though, that this genre can still survive. Yooka-Laylee was an attempt that was made, but it was just a little bit too big and open, and it just didn't quite feel the same way that those classics did. But then on the flip side, there's games like A Hat in Time, which does seem to comprehend what made those collectathons so much fun, and this game, seriously, is just so great and charming across the board. If you haven't tried it out yet, it's like a classic Banjo-Kazooie type collectathon, but with the art style of like The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. Not only are the controls tight, the collecting is fun, but also the design and world building is incredibly charming. Still, we need a game that's like a sequel to Donkey Kong 64 because I need to play as my boy Chunky at least one more time in my life. Now, of course, as a Nintendo fan, you can't talk about neglect and heartbreak without at least mentioning Mother 3. Now, of course, also known as the Earthbound series, these games are absolutely loved by the RPG community. A lot of us only ever found out about characters like Ness and Lucas from Super Smash Bros., but man, the source that these characters come from is absolutely incredible. Now, one of the biggest tragedies, though, is that Mother 3, a game that was released in Japan on the Game Boy Advance, never saw a translated release of the game, meaning a ton of players who would love to experience this game would never get the opportunity to. Now, fortunately enough, after a couple of years of Nintendo just ignoring the demand from the fan base for a translation, a group of dedicated fans ended up translating the entire game over a course of 2 years and released a fan patch where players who have a ROM of the game can patch the game, allowing for the game to be played in English. Still, to be able to experience Mother 3 in an official capacity would be absolutely incredible, just to be able to have this game alongside our other collections of games. Every time Nintendo talks about upcoming things for the Game Boy Advance Switch Online emulator that they have, the fact that Mother 3's localization hasn't been released yet is really tragic, and Nintendo is very much so aware of the demand of this game. They even made jokes about it at an E3 presentation years ago.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3!
How about this instead?
Now, this clip was all the way back in 2014, so it's very clear Nintendo has known what fans have wanted and just said, no, we're not gonna give it to them. I do feel bad for players who really want to experience this game, but at the same time, you should feel bad maybe for the Earthbound fans as well. Since the release of Mother 3, there has never been another Mother Earthbound game to release. ever. That's pretty disappointing, and it seemed like at some point, at least along the lines, Nintendo did feel like there was a lot of potential for this series. Even for a while, there was an entire Nintendo 64 game being made at the time called Mother 3, which ended up getting scrapped, but at least at some point we know Nintendo saw the potential in that game series. Now, the closest thing we've had is there have been a lot of fan demand for a new game, and for a long time there was a Mother 4 fan project being made, but due to being afraid of getting sued, the team decided to pivot to just make the game a spiritual sequel and remove all references to the actual game series. But then the game went into development hell, and we don't know what's going on with the game. More recently, there was another project to make a fan-made sequel called Mother 4 Again, which is in early development. And these fan games get a lot of attention compared to other game series that have fan games made, because there's a high demand for a new Mother game. Nintendo, where are you at? What are you doing? Also, it's worth mentioning this, if you look at the Nintendo Switch Lite, ARMS is a very peculiar game if you think about it. Nowadays, it's not too often we see Nintendo just launch a brand new intellectual property with a universe and characters that are kind of obviously built with the future in mind for the character. And when they showed off ARMS, this looked exactly like the standard Nintendo new IP. Just a few years earlier, they did the same type of thing with Splatoon, and that became a massive hit. So for a while, it looked like ARMS was going to be the next big thing. Then the game released, was okay, and it was never talked about again or brought up. We did see ARMS representation, though, in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which was a very big deal because you have to be an established game to make it into this. So it was obvious Nintendo really expected a lot from ARMS. So what's going on with it now? I don't know if maybe they overbanked on how much fun ARMS would be or the success of ARMS, and maybe they have doubts for a potential sequel, but I do have to say it is surprising to see Nintendo put so much effort into designing these characters, building out this world. They spent a ton of time just marketing this game, for them not to try to iterate something else with ARMS sometime in the future. Maybe it was because the Switch player base at the beginning wasn't as massive as it is nowadays, with a much more casual audience buying the Nintendo Switches in the mid to later years of the Switch's life. I'm surprised that Nintendo hasn't tried some sort of spin-off or something else utilizing this world that was built, and then to try to pair it with maybe a little bit different type of gameplay. This one's not maybe as crucial for the topic at hand here, but still, it does feel like ARMS as a new upcoming franchise series maybe was kind of forgotten about. Let's switch gears and talk about like the little engine that couldn't, like, just couldn't at all, just gave up, and that's the end. Chibi-Robo! The story behind the Chibi-Robo games is kind of a tragic tale. Chibi-Robos existed for quite a while as a series that continuously tried to put out games that would be very popular in both the West and Japan. And I gotta say, no matter what we say about this game, you can't deny the fact that the developers believed in this game series and its character. They thought that Chibi-Robo had every right to be one of the biggest video game characters of all time. But unfortunately for Skip Ltd, the developers of this game series, most of the entries never really blew up in the way that they had expected. A lot of the games would just barely be a little bit of a commercial success, but nothing to like write home about. But since Skip Ltd had a close relationship with publisher Nintendo, they weren't ever willing to give up with Chibi-Robo, so in 2015, Chibi-Robo Ziplash for the 3DS was announced. What's really interesting is if you read up on some of the interviews prior to this game's release, it seemed like the developers knew that this was like the all or nothing attempt to finally get Chibi-Robo the recognition that it needed. Both of the main producer, Kensuke Tanabe, and the director, Risa Tabata, had talked about how they'd like to make more Chibi-Robo games, but Tanabe outright said that if this game did not sell well, it would be the last entry of the series. That's a pretty definitive statement to say pre-release. He also went on to say, "I've continually thought about ways to build this into mainstream success. We've challenged ourselves in assorted ways along those lines, but I can't say that we've found the answer yet." There was a lot on the line, and when it was time for the game to release, it really didn't do too well. In the UK, it failed to appear on the top 40 selling 3DS games. Like that week, it was still outsold by Mario Kart 7 that was almost 4 years old at that point. In Japan, the game sold around 1,400 copies, which placed it around 9th place for Japan video games that week. And after that, nothing was really heard of from Chibi-Robo again. Now, the game itself had mixed to positive reviews, but nonetheless, it was a critical and commercial failure. Now, of course, there hasn't been any news on Chibi-Robo, but that didn't stop the Nintendo fanbase and the small Chibi-Robo fanbase to still speculate that more could come in the future. I remember in 2017, 2018, there was a lot of speculation that Chibi-Robo would be introduced for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. That never happened. Fans thought perhaps the company was working on another Chibi-Robo game, but nothing's been announced, and actually now that it's been quite a few years, a lot of people are speculating as to whether or not the company is even open anymore. Their website domain has now gone completely dead. The CEO doesn't have the website in his Twitter profile, and the building that had the offices for Skip Ltd is occupied by a different company now. So unless Skip Ltd has a new office somewhere and they're working super secretly quiet, their company might be gone altogether. It's always sad when this type of stuff happens, but they did bank on Chibi-Robo being really successful, and I don't think that that game necessarily had that potential. The platforming itself was fun, but there was nothing memorable or extra that really would make it stand out against a game like Mario, for example. So, rest in peace, Chibi-Robo Ziplash. You will be remembered. Listen, besides just the games that Nintendo kind of neglects, there's a lot of other things that they just don't necessarily do right, and it is 2023 and friend codes still exist. Yeah, I never understood this, why we can't just have an ID system like what Xbox or PlayStation has, or even like a hashtag system like Discord used to have. Anything is better than friend codes, please. I don't know, Nintendo has been notoriously known for having an archaic online service. Even in Animal Crossing, traveling to a friend's island should be easier than it is. It shouldn't have to be strings of dialogue, a lot of waiting around, everyone having to stop in place anytime anyone comes or goes. I mean, if they could figure out how to just have players drop in and out of their games overall, that would be such a win for Nintendo, and this technology has existed for a very long time already. I sometimes wonder if the reason why so many of Nintendo's new releases have co-op, but they're only restricted to couch co-op and not online connectivity, is partially due to the fact that they can't get it right. There has been some co-op games released that have a lot of latency issues or lag, making the game seem unplayable, but I just feel like we're way past the point of this. Also, there's other little weird, nuanced things that Nintendo has done over the years, like instead of having a built-in voice chat system like what Xbox and PlayStation have, we get some mobile app that we're supposed to connect our phones to, and then we plug the headphones up into our phones, and then we can talk through there. That's a lot of extra steps. I even remember they had this whole Animal Crossing tie-in thing where you could like type your messages on your phone and then it would send the message quicker on the Switch than if you had to type with the keyboard on the Switch. Listen, if you're gonna do the whole phone thing, at least make it more intuitive than what we have, because this just feels like extra hoops. Now, I would forgive it if they gave us a really cool mount or something for our phones, and then maybe let us play some DS games on the Nintendo Online service, and let us use our phone as the touchscreen. Maybe some Wii U games that never got ported over. I don't know, just throwing some ideas out there. I don't know. Am I way off on all of this? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. Is there anything you particularly disagree with, or is there something that just speaks to you personally, like Animal Crossing speaks to me here, and that we need a new game? If you're new, make sure you are subscribed, double check down there. I'll see you guys all next time with a new video.